Hey guys, tonight we're going to step way back in time and put ourselves right in the middle of a place you absolutely do not want to be. Sparta. Specifically, we're looking at what it would be like to exist as a Helotage, the state-owned, perpetually terrified, enslaved population that made the whole Spartan military machine run. Imagine this for a second, and really let your shoulders relax as you picture it. This is sleepy time, after all. You're not scrolling social media. You're not thinking about tomorrow's schedule. Instead, you are trudging through the olive groves of the Peloponnese, the red dust settling on your ankles. You can feel the sun-baked ground beneath your worn sandals. The air is thick and smells of dry grass and faintly of your own fear. You hear the rhythmic, distant clank of bronze against leather, and you know without looking that a Spartan patrol is somewhere nearby, their presence, a suffocating pressure, even before you see them. You are utterly exhausted, your hands blistered from a day of working land that is ancestrally yours, but legally, irrevocably their property. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That your entire existence is suddenly reduced to providing grain for the most fearsome military state of the ancient world. You are the engine of their perfection. You are not just a slave. You are a permanent, unwilling member of a collective that outnumbers its masters by a terrifying margin, a fact that both guarantees your utility and ensures your continuous, brutal oppression. Before we even get into the daily grind, here's a little reality check. If you or I, with our modern sensibilities and soft constitutions, were dropped into this life in the 5th century BCE, you probably wouldn't survive the first 3 months. The system is designed to crush your spirit and discard your body. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know your location and local time in the comments. It's a strange comfort knowing we're all drifting off together from around the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey begins as it did for the majority of the Helots, the Messenians' conquests. This isn't the sort of slavery where you're kidnapped by pirates, shipped far away, and sold on a bustling dock, though that was certainly a feature of the ancient world. No, for you, it was a sudden, violent upheaval on your very own soil. You lived in Messenia, a rich, fertile region to the west of Mount Taygetus, separated from Sparta by a majestic, unyielding mountain range. The Spartans, a highly organized, land-hungry force, conquered your ancestors not once, but in a series of brutal conflicts known as the Messenian Wars. This wasn't just a border skirmish, it was a total annexation, a power move designed to secure the agricultural foundation for their unique, militarily focused society. The soil of Messenia was simply too good to leave to independent neighbors. You are now living the consequence of this decades-long conflict. You remember faintly the stories your grandmother whispered, tales of the great Messenian hero Aristomenes and the hopeless last stand on Mount Ithome. Those stories are your dangerous inheritance. They are the forbidden fire of your collective identity, a memory of freedom that the Spartan state strives daily to extinguish. You are no longer Messenian. You are a Helot, a name that some historians suggest may come from the Greek word halonai, meaning to be captured or taken. It's a beautifully simple, brutal definition of your new status, the long march into the territory of Laconia, or your new life within the conquered fields of Messenia, is where the dread truly settles in. You are moving with hundreds, perhaps thousands of your kin and neighbors, not in chains, but under the terrifying escort of men whose lives are literally nothing but war. You see the Spartans for the first time up close, and they are everything the rumors claim: lean, quiet, and possessed of a frightening, effortless coordination. They don't shout. They don't swagger. They simply are. Their bronze armor catches the high sun, and their silence is louder than any threat. You are just one person among a massive, newly enslaved population. And this is the first crucial distinction, the mainstream historical fact, that separates your fate from that of a chattel slave in Athens. You are not the private property of an individual Spartan. You are owned by the bikoikom state itself. Your body and your labor belong to Lakedaemon, the combined Spartan state. The land you are assigned to work, the kleros, is also state-owned, merely allotted to a specific Spartan citizena, Spartiate, to support his communal mess hall, dues his military training, and his family. This system creates a terrifying, inescapable trap. Think about it: a typical slave in Athens or Corinth might have a chance to purchase their freedom, or their individual master might, in a moment of benevolence, grant manumission. Their fate rests with one person. Your fate as a helot rests with an entire, hostile, militarized state. There is no one person you can appeal to. There is no individual who can simply decide you are free. Your bond is to the land and to the polis, and that bond is permanent and hereditary. Your children will be helots, and their children after them. You are a member of an entire, perpetually hostile underclass. You are a prison inmate whose prison walls extend across an entire fertile plain. This unique feature of the Spartan system is, in my opinion, the single biggest reason why you would not survive, not physically, but spiritually, the absolute finality of it. This state ownership model leads to a slightly quirky or fringe tidbit. Because you are state property, you are technically not a chattel slave, but something closer to a serf. You are tied to the land. You can't be sold away from Spartan territory. In theory, this sounds kinder than being sold across the sea, but in practice, it's a terrifying advantage for your master. He doesn't have to worry about you running away and being resold in a distant city-state. The entire polis is your warden, and every Spartiate is a legally sanctioned, fully trained enforcer of your confinement. You're given a tiny patch of ground to call your Ona hut, maybe a small garden plot, next to your assigned kleros. This is a deliberate design choice, a clever bit of statecraft. By allowing you to form families and maintain a community structure, the Spartans avoid the huge logistical headache of policing individual slaves constantly. But the moment you or your community step out of line, the iron fist descends without hesitation, as you are first assigned to your kleros. You hear the debates among the other newly captured Messenians, a low, nervous murmur. They are trying to make sense of this legal limbo. Historians still argue whether the Helots status should be classified as slavery or serfdom, a collective subjugation where the population itself is legally branded as property. But you standing in the dust with a rough leather cap already marking your head, know the truth. In your bones, the legal name doesn't matter when the ultimate punishment for disobedience is death decreed by your rulers, who treat the mere act of your survival as a calculated risk. Your status is the worst of both worlds, the permanent generational bondage of serfdom, combined with the casual state-sanctioned violence of slavery. The sun begins to set over the imposing bulk of Mount Taygetus, casting long purple shadows across the plain. Your first day as a helot ends not with a break, but with a deep, crushing weariness. You trudge toward the cluster of rough stone and mud huts where your family will now live. The air is cooling, but the fear remains a warm, acrid taste in your mouth. You understand one thing clearly now: you are the bedrock of the Spartan world. And the only way the Spartans can ensure their elite lifestyle is by ensuring that you, the majority, remain eternally terrified of them, the few. You are now a state-owned prison, a movable piece of property that by law cannot be moved too far. This collective status, which we touched on last time, isn't a minor legal footnote. It's the Helots caste, a state-owned prison. And it dictates the relentless tenor of your life. Imagine the constant low-level buzz of anxiety that comes from knowing the entire machinery of the government, the most feared military on the Greek peninsula, is organized primarily to keep you down. The whole system is built on this foundation of fears: the Spartans' fear of you and your well-justified fear of them. The great mainstream historical fact you internalize quickly is that this arrangement is the deliberate invention of the Spartan state to solve their greatest problem: land and labor. By conquering Messenia and creating the Helot class, Sparta became perhaps the only major Greek city-state that didn't need to send its male citizens out to work. That's why the Spartan man, the homoios or equal, can dedicate his entire existence to the agoge, the brutal military training, and to the endless ritualized preparation for war. Your suffering is literally their freedom. You and your neighbors are, as the ancient authors describe it, sui generis. A class all their own, somewhere between free men and slaves. But let's be honest that in-between status offers little comfort when you're collapsing from exhaustion in the fields. You might not be bought and sold individually like a piece of pottery, but the state can just as easily decide to sell off an entire chunk of your Messenian territory, and you and your family go with the land. Your bondage is simply geographically limited, which again just reinforces the knowledge that there is no escape over the horizon. The horizon is the prison wall. The entire arrangement is founded on an immense demographic imbalance. You, the Helots, vastly outnumber the Spartan citizens, while exact figures are impossible to confirm. And historians still argue whether the ratio was 3-to-1, 5-to-1, or even 7-to-1 at its peak. You can feel that numerical advantage every time you gather in a field. This is the one quirky or fringe tidbit. Of your servitude, your existence is a constant palpable threat to your masters. The Spartans live in a state of perpetual state-sanctioned paranoia. Aristotle, a keen observer of Greek politics, famously described the Helots as an enemy constantly sitting in wait of the disasters of the Spartans. You are not simply labor. You are an occupied nation, perpetually on the verge of revolt. This paranoia is why the Spartan state has such tight control. You are assigned to a kleros, the land allotment belonging to a Spartiate family, and your sole duty is to farm that land and provide a fixed quota, a produce known as the apo-phora. We'll delve into the crushing weight of the apo-phora soon, but understand that this quota payment is the lifeblood of the Spartan citizen. If he can't make his mandatory contribution to his communal mess hall, the Sicilian, he loses his citizenship, his status as an equal, and descends into the miserable ranks of the hypomaians, or inferiors. The fear of your Spartan master losing his citizenship is transferred directly to you as a terrifying zero-tolerance expectation of production. You are responsible for his social standing. Talk about performance anxiety. You're breaking your back, so a guy who doesn't talk much can have his mandatory military cafeteria meal. Because the state owns you, your master cannot mistreat you simply on a whim in a financial sense. He can't work you to death because that damages state's property. Right, wrong. The Spartan citizen has the ultimate sanction, a kind of cultural license to inflict terror designed not for profit, but for psychological control. You might be state property, but you are assigned to a citizen, and that citizen's right to beat abuse or casually murder you is virtually unchecked, provided he follows the proper rituals. The Spartans are less concerned with maintaining the value of the property than they are with maintaining the terror that keeps the property subdued. Your life is organized around a system of subtle but absolute control. You live in your ancestral village, not a master's barracks, which sounds like a privilege, but it simply means the state requires you to house and feed yourself while producing their profit. You speak your own language or a dialect close enough to it, and you maintain your own religious practices again, only because it's easier to control a people who are allowed a FOD of cultural continuity. But look at the subtle ways they mark you. You might be forced to wear a distinctive piece of clothing like a dogskin cap, kine, or rough leather garments so that you are instantly identifiable in public. This is the constant low-grade public humiliation that is part of the system's design. It's not just a uniform. It's a branding, a walking advertisement of your subjugated status, ensuring that no Spartiate ever forgets your place. You quickly learn the rules of engagement. You must always step aside when a Spartiate walks by. You must never look him directly in the eye. You must never speak unless spoken to. And when you do speak, your voice must be suitably subservient. You are not allowed to sing traditional Messenian songs of freedom or pride. The moment you display any sign of high spirit, of a prideful posture, or of an education that might make you think too much, you become a target. Why? Because the Spartan state views any Helot with ambition, strength, or leadership potential as a premeditated threat that must be culled. This isn't just about labor management. This is counterinsurgency carried out in the light of day. It is an anxiety-ridden, knife-edge existence where maintaining a completely beaten, subservient Ephors is your best and perhaps only survival tool. You must pretend to be less than you are every moment of every day just to see the sun rise tomorrow. The entire state is for you one continuous, heavily armed psychological operation. The sun is already climbing, pulling the moisture from the Messenian plain, and you're jolted out of the brief, inadequate rest you managed to snatch in your crowded hut. The soft background hum of the fan you just heard fades into the relentless sounds of a Greek agricultural dawn, the braying of a mule, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith from the nearby Perioikoi settlement, and the coarse shouting of the overseer, not a Spartan, but likely a loyal Helot foreman, which is its own kind of shame. This is our day in the field, the agricultural grind, and it is the single most defining feature of your existence. Your survival is measured in barley and olive oil. The Spartan citizen, the homoios, is legally prohibited from engaging in any manual labor or craft deemed beneath his military dignity, which is basically everything that isn't spear-waving or talking about honor. This mainstream historical fact means the entire Spartan economy rests squarely on your shoulders. You are the sole reason they can be professional soldiers. You are tied to the kleros, that state-owned plot of highly fertile land assigned to your Spartan master. You trudge into the field. The labor is backbreaking, primitive, and relentless. You're using wooden plows tipped, if you're lucky, with a scrap of iron pulled by oxen or mules. The soil of Messenia is rich, which is exactly why the Spartans conquered it. But even rich soil requires constant toil. You are responsible for the entire Mediterranean agricultural cycle, the autumn planting of barley and wheat, the spring weeding the crucial summer harvest under the blistering sun, and the painstaking autumn olive harvest. You're constantly hunched over. Your back screams, your hands are calloused and cracked, and the dust is permanently caked in the creases of your face. You work from dawn until dusk. There's no union, no regulated work schedule, and no concept of overtime pay. Your wage is simply the right to exist for another day and feed your family with whatever's left after. The quota is met. The fear in the field is a dry, constant presence. You aren't just farming. You are performing an economic necessity under armed psychological duress. You glance up, often scanning the low hills for dust clouds that signal a patrol. The Spartans rarely supervise the daily grind directly. They are too concerned with their military training and communal life, but they rely on trusted agents and the terrifying randomness of their check-ins to keep you in line. This leads us to a quirky or fringe tidbit about Greek agriculture in general. One of the keys to farming the thin, rocky Greek soil was a technique called biennial crop rotation. You would plant grain one year, and the next year you would leave the field, fallow when planted, to let the soil recover its nutrients. But in rich Messenia, the demand from Sparta was so high that you were often forced to push the land to its limit, planting cereals like barley and wheat, and then immediately working the ground for the next cycle. You are essentially strip mining the land of your ancestors to fuel the oppressive state. The consequent soil exhaustion and smaller yields, which only increases the pressure on you to meet that rigid quota. It's a system designed for maximum immediate output regardless of the long-term cost to the land or your body. When you pause for your brief midday meal, you are chewing on hard barley bread, maybe some wild greens, and a few olives. You think of your masters, the Spartans, and their infamous cuisine. Their diet is mythologized for its austerity, and their most famous dish is the black broth, or melas zomos. It's a culinary masterpiece of Spartan propaganda. Our ancient sources describe it as being made from boiled pork blood salt and vinegar. Plutarch records a story where a visitor from another city-state tried the broth and couldn't hide his disgust. The Spartan who served it replied, "We require a Spartan to relish this broth for only those who exercise by the Helotage. River can enjoy it. In other words, you need to be half-starved and physically exhausted for it to taste good." The joke, which is both dark and subtle, is that while the Spartan citizen is eating his famous, disgusting black broth as a symbol of his discipline and dedication, you are eating barely enough to sustain the labor that allows him to eat that broth in the first place. His austerity is based on your total deprivation. His meal is a choice, yours is a ration. The I-light joke here is that the black broth may have been intentionally awful just to prove how tough they were. Like saying, "I choose to drink this dirt water because I'm better than you," while you're actually drinking less than dirt water because you have no other choice. Back to the field. Your work is not just cereal farming. You are also tending the vines for wine and the precious ancient olive trees that anchor the economy. The olives in particular require delicate, precise handling. One wrong move, one dropped crop means failure, and failure means punishment. There is no anonymity in this. Your work output is directly tied to the kleros of your specific master. He knows exactly who is responsible for the bad harvest. He might live in Sparta, but he maintains an obsessive detailed knowledge of his land's production because his own status depends on it. This is the great frustrating debate that surrounds your very condition. Historians still argue whether, yes, the Helots had any real economic incentive to produce a surplus above the apo-phora, the required quota. On one hand, you were technically allowed to keep the excess, which theoretically would motivate you to work harder, but on the other hand, a helot who grew wealthy or amassed a significant surplus would instantly become suspect in the eyes of the paranoid Spartan state. Any sign of prosperity or strength among the helots was immediately perceived as a step toward revolt. So the question remains, do you risk being marked as a dangerous, ambitious helot by having a successful harvest, or do you work just hard enough to survive and meet the demand? The former risks death. The latter risks starvation. You are trapped in an economic calculation where the best choice is often to appear perpetually poor, yet miraculously productive. As the afternoon sun starts to beat down the shadows, shrink to nothing, and the heat becomes oppressive, the physical labor is a kind of blur, a monotonous, rhythmic task that keeps your mind from wandering to dangerous places. You tie the barley stalks together. You move the heavy, wet clay soil. You sweat, and the sweat stings your eyes. The exhaustion is the weight of the state itself pressing down on you. You've finished the arduous labor of the day, but the end of physical work doesn't mean the end of your servitude. It simply shifts the form of the pressure. Now you must deal with the human element of your oppression. The Spartan master, oligarchic detachment. You've spent all day on his kleros, but you might go weeks without seeing him. And when you do, it's a chilling demonstration of power that's less about malice and more about profound systemic indifference. The mainstream historical fact is that the Spartan citizen, the Spartiate, is trained from age 7 in the agoge, a system that strips away individual identity and forges a relentless military focus. Their entire self-worth is tied to the concept of homoios, being an equal among peers and their success in war. This obsession with military perfection comes at a cost not just to them, but to you. They are trained to see themselves as instruments of the state, and they are trained to see you as necessary, but dangerously hostile, subhuman machinery. Your master, let's call him Lycurgus, because you know every Spartan story needs a Lycurgus, even if the real one, probably never existed, is not a typical slave owner. He is not financially vested in your well-being in the way a master in, say, an Athenian mine might be. Since the state owns you, Lycurgus' interest in you is purely functional and existential. You are simply the mechanism that produces the grain wine and oil required for his secession. Contribution is compulsory dinner club membership. Fail to produce the quota, and Lycurgus loses his citizenship and his social standing. His contempt for you is rooted in the fact that his perfect life relies on your necessary, ugly, non-military work. When Lycurgus arrives at the edge of your fields, he's probably accompanied by a few younger men, part of a patrol, or simply exercising their right to roam and maintain dominance. He doesn't look at you with anger, which you could understand, or pity, which you would dismiss. He looks at you with a chilling, oligarchic detachment. You are a piece of furniture, perhaps a particularly smelly piece of machinery that sometimes breaks down and needs to be replaced. You must remember the Spartan ideal of laconic speech. They are famously brief, blunt, and to the point. This extends to their cruelty. They don't waste breath on long theatrical speeches about your inferiority. A single sharp command, perhaps a casual strike from a walking stick, is often all you get. This makes the brutality unpredictable and terrifying. You are dealing with men who are conditioned to endure pain, and therefore they have a profound, total lack of empathy for the suffering of others. They are simply not wired to recognize the exhaustion, the fear, or the despair you carry. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that the Spartan system actually encouraged a certain amount of casual random abuse towards the Helots as a matter of policy. It wasn't just tolerated, it was a way of reinforcing the social hierarchy. One ancient writer, Myron of Preen, mentions that Helots were ritually beaten a fixed number of times a year, whether they had done anything wrong or not, just to remind them of their status. Imagine an annual tax on your skin. This wasn't about punishment. It was about our ideological warfare. You are required to submit to the degradation so publicly and so routinely that the act of submission becomes part of your identity. It's a system that requires you to publicly accept that your body is not your own and that your life is forfeit. This psychological terror is a constant weapon. Lycurgus, your master, might instruct you to perform some ridiculous, demeaning task simply to demonstrate his absolute power. He might force you to drink pure, undiluted wine and then display you in public, staggering and slurring so that the young Spartan boys, the next generation of masters, could see what a drunk helot looked like. This is a very light joke. On their part, a sort of anti-temperance lesson, but for you it is a deliberate, state-mandated ritual of public shaming. You are a live-action, cautionary, moral tale for children. See, boys, this is what happens if you don't stick to the agage. You end up drinking good wine without watering it down. Terrible fate. The relationship is further complicated by the fact that your master's family may employ you in domestic tasks as well. You might find yourself working inside his house, serving his wife, or caring for his children. This proximity is a strange tension. On one hand, you gain a small, almost microscopic window into the life of the homoios, seeing their austerity up close. But on the other, you are in the most dangerous position, constant intimate exposure to the people whose paranoia is your undoing. The sheer logical failure of this dynamic is something the ancient world itself debated. Historians still argue whether the Spartans' decision to use a large native and inherently rebellious population as their primary labor force was a stroke of genius or a fatal error. Did the economic necessity of supporting a professional army outweigh the perpetual military constraint placed on Sparta by the threat of a massive Helot revolt? The answer for you is simple. The fatal error is yours for being born into the situation. You watch Lycurgus depart his posture, stiff his silence unbroken. You feel the relief drain into your stomach, quickly replaced by the familiar, gnawing anxiety. The encounter was short, brutal, and meaningless to him, but it dictates your next few weeks. He has established dominance. He has ensured compliance. And you have retreated into the only place he can't reach, the private, guarded chambers of your mind where the memory of Messenian freedom still flickers. But even those thoughts you know must be kept hidden, because the Spartans have ways of finding out what you think. They are always watching. That private guarded chamber of your mind, the one place the Spartan master cannot reach, is mostly filled with thoughts of your family. This is the Helot family unit, a fragile foundation. This is one of the few faint distinctions between your existence and that of a typical chattel slave elsewhere in the Greek world, and it is a double-edged sword that cuts deeply into your peace of mind. The mainstream historical fact is that the Spartan system, unlike many other forms of ancient slavery, permitted you to live in family units and maintain a community structure in your villages. You are not forced into barracks or separated from your spouse and children immediately after capture. This wasn't kindness, it was pure pragmatism. Since the Helots were the permanent hereditary labor force and the Spartans were forbidden from working, The state needed you to reproduce and teach your children the specific skills required to farm that kleros efficiently. You were allowed to self-reproduce to ensure the next generation of labor was automatically provided to the state. You might be married. Your children might play in the dust outside your rough hut. This small kernel of domestic life is the only thing that makes the back-breaking labor bearable. It is the reason you endure the abuse and meet the quota. You are working for them, the state, but you are surviving for yourselves, your family. This creates a powerful, complicated resilience that the Spartans simultaneously relied upon and feared. The fragility, however, is woven into the very fabric of this unit. While you are allowed to form a family, you have absolutely no legal rights to maintain it. The state can at any moment intervene and separate your family for the good of the polis. A Spartan master might demand that your young son be sent to his home in Sparta to serve as a mothax, a non-Spartan child raised alongside Spartan boys. This sometimes offered a remote, convoluted chance at eventual freedom for the boy, but for you it is the trauma of separation and the agonizing knowledge that your child is now growing up steeped in the culture of your oppressors. You might also be required to send your wife to Sparta to serve as a wet nurse. Spartan women, famously athletic and physically robust, often hired Helot women to suckle their children, ensuring the purity of their own bloodlines and focusing on physical training. This practice is the quirky or fringe tidbit of Helot domestic life, a Spartan mother who enjoys far more freedom and independence than women in Athens of owning property, which is extremely rare in ancient Greece, nonetheless relies entirely on a subjugated Helot woman to feed her child. Your milk literally nurtures the next generation of your oppressors. Your wife is physically close to the Spartiate family, caring for their children in intimate detail, but she is separated from her own, creating a cruel, emotional chasm in your home. This proximity of domestic servitude is constantly on your mind. You joke dryly with your neighbor, a very light joke. Amidst the heavy silence of the fields, you know Lycurgus's wife just complained that my eldest boy, who is helping out in their house now, doesn't polish the bronze shield with enough elan. I guess I should have taught him less farming and more shining. Maybe he'll have a shot at freedom if I teach the next one how to fold a perfect military cloak. The joke falls flat heavy with the reality that even the smallest perceived imperfection in your domestic service can bring swift collective punishment upon your village. This inherent contradiction, allowing the family unit to exist while reserving the right to shatter it, was key to the Spartan system of control. The family was a lever, a point of weakness that they could exploit. You would rather endure any personal beating than see your spouse or child harmed or permanently taken away. The legal and ethical gray area of your status is something that even contemporary philosophers like Aristotle puzzled over. Historians still argue whether the Helot family's legal existence made their condition morally superior or simply more tragically complicated than chattel slavery. Did the ability to form bonds make the oppression easier to bear, or did it just provide the masters with a more effective emotional hostage? For you, the difference is moot. You live under the constant shadow of the state's veto, knowing that the thing you love most is the thing that makes you the most compliant. Every child you raise is another guarantee that you will stay on the kleros and produce the apo-phora. As evening falls, you sit outside your hut. Your children are asleep. You listen to the sounds of the village, the quiet Greek language, the same dialect that was spoken by your free ancestors. You look at your wife and you realize that she too is exhausted. her hands raw from the loom or the domestic chores she might have been forced to perform for the Spartiate family. You hold your small family close, a fragile, non-legal entity sustained purely by your physical exhaustion, fully aware that this moment of quiet safety exists only by the grace of the state that has vowed to crush any collective spirit you might harbor. The agricultural season progresses, and with it, the pressure intensifies. Your existence is defined by a non-negotiable metric: tribute and terror quota, and punishment. This is where the theoretical cruelty of the Spartan state becomes a direct, crushing reality in your daily life. The core of your economic servitude is the apo-phora, the required quota of produce you must hand over to your Spartan master, Lycurgus, who, remember, requires it to maintain his citizenship. The mainstream historical fact is that this was a fixed amount often cited in ancient sources as being around 70 medimnoi of barley for the man and a lesser amount for his wife, plus a proportional quantity of oil and wine. A medimnos is a large measure, roughly 52 liters. Imagine trying to produce and store the equivalent of 70 large sacks of grain, along with dozens of amphorae of oil and wine, simply to meet the state's demand, leaving you to survive on whatever is left over. The brilliance and the horror of the apo-phora is that it's not a percentage, but a fixed amount. If the harvest is excellent, you and your family get to keep the surplus, which in theory allows you to save and even thrive. But if there's a drought, if the spring rains fail, or if a pestilence sweeps through the olives, the demand does not change. 70 medimnoi is still 70 medimnoi. You must deliver it even if doing so means starving your own family. The Spartan citizen has protected himself from natural disaster by shifting the entire economic risk onto you, the Helot. Your days are filled with the fear of shortfall. As the harvest approaches, every head of barley is counted, every olive is scrutinized. You constantly worry that your Spartan master will arrive and accuse you of holding back, of hiding grain. This fear is rooted in ancient anti-Helot policy. The poet Tertius, centuries before, described your ancestors bringing of dire necessity to their masters the half of all the fruits the cornland bears, like asses toiling under heavy burden. Whether it was a fixed quota or a sharecropping system of half the harvest, and historians still argue whether the apo-phora, evolved from a percentage to a fixed amount over time. The outcome for you is the same, the bare minimum for survival, maintained by extreme coercion. Failure to meet the quota does not result in a court hearing or a fine. It results in savage ritualistic beatings and possibly death. This is where the terror part of your life's equation truly comes into play. You live under a state of perpetual legalized hostility. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly encapsulates the Spartan psychological warfare, the ritualized, mandatory beating. The anti-Spartan historian Myron of Priene claimed that Helots were required to receive a stipulated number of beatings every year, regardless of any wrongdoing, just so they would never forget they were slaves. Now, whether this was a literal calendar-based event or simply a common state-sanctioned practice is up for debate. But the belief in this ritual, the knowledge that you could be arbitrarily brutalized for the sake of a cultural mandate, is the terrifying reality. It removes all connection between action and consequence. You cannot earn safety through good behavior. Safety is an illusion. The system is designed to ensure that the punishment is not just physical, but symbolic. You are not just being beaten. You are being told publicly and painfully that your existence is an inconvenience and that your body is simply a tool of the state. It is a light joke. The Spartans have with the gods, really. They have managed to make an act of casual violence a form of religious observance. We have to beat you, don't you see? Otherwise, the gods might think we respect you, and that would be bad luck for Sparta. And then there is the ultimate instrument of terror, the annual formal declaration of war on the Helots. Every year, when the new body of Ephors, the 5 Spartan overseers, took office, they would perform a ritual. They would formally declare war on the Helot population. Think about that for a moment. This single bureaucratic act was the most terrifying political move in the Greek world. It was a preemptive theological sanction. Since Greek religion held that it was sacrilegious, an act of miasma, or blood guilt to kill a free person, during peacetime, the Spartans simply solved the problem. By declaring a perpetual state of war, the Ephors ensured that any Spartan could kill a Helot at any time without fear of religious or legal pollution. You live in this permanent state of war. You are a civilian living in a legally sanctioned military zone where the occupying forces have immunity. You understand that your life is forfeit at the whim of any homoios, not just your own master. It's a chilling reminder that your status as a state-owned prison means the entire state is both your keeper and your potential executioner. You are defined by the apo-phora, the production quota, and by the Ephors Declaration, the perpetual death sentence. Both forces combine to keep you perpetually working, perpetually terrified, and absolutely certain of your own unimportance. The only thing that matters is the barley in the Spartan mess hall. Even under the constant whip of the apo-phora and the paralyzing fear of the Ephors annual declaration, there is one thing the Spartans can never truly conquer: the Messenian identity, resistance, and memory. This is the dangerous inner life you must carefully conceal, the defiant flicker that makes you so unlike other slaves in the ancient world. The fundamental, mainstream historical fact. Differentiating you, the Messenian Helots, from chattel slaves is that you are a collective, conquered people living on your ancestral land. You share a common language, a Doric dialecta, common history, and a vivid, shared memory of a time when the Spartans were simply an aggressive neighbor, not an absolute master. This sense of national identity, violently suppressed but never eradicated, is the secret weapon of the Helots and the perpetual Achilles heel of Sparta. You, your parents, and your grandparents all know the same stories. You remember the names of the old kings and the heroes who fought during the Messenian wars. You secretly recite the poetry of the Spartan poet Tertius, not for its praise of Spartan might, but for the chilling lines that describe your condition. Like asses toiling under heavy burden, they will bring their masters under bitter compulsion half of all fruits their plowed lands yield. You hear the disgust in the Spartans' own verse, and in that disgust you find a defiant pride. They acknowledge the sheer weight of your burden, and thus the depth of your endurance. They know you are not slaves in the typical sense. You are prisoners of war working the engine of their state. This leads to a quirky or fringe tidbit about cultural memory, the preservation of your language and customs. While Thucydides claimed the Helots spoke the same language as the Spartans, Doric later historians noted that the Messenians, who were later freed and settled at Naupactus, maintained their dialect and sense of shared heritage for generations. You may use a subservient vocabulary when speaking to your master, but the words you whisper to your children at night, the names you give them, and the songs you murmur quietly, always quietly, are threads that weave your identity back to a time of freedom. Your resistance is mostly passive, a psychological and cultural fortress. It is the silent, shared understanding when a new baby is born. A Messenian born into servitude on Messenian soil. It is the subtle, collective solidarity when a Spartan patrol passes by. You watch your neighbor receive a casual, arbitrary beating for some imagined slight, and though you show no emotion, the shared anger becomes a low burning heat deep in your chest. That silence, that endurance, is your form of defiance. The Spartan system is designed to seek out and destroy this internal resilience. The mandatory dogskin cap, the forced drunkenness in front of Spartan youths, these are all attempts to shame the Messenian identity, to make you feel like a beast, not a man. This is where your individual spirit is tested most severely. You must wear the cap, you must endure the drunken spectacle, but you must ensure your inner self remains untouched, unbowed, and secretly aware of the historical truth. You contemplate the sheer logical paradox of your situation. Historians still argue whether the existence of a common collective Messenian identity made the Helots better able to endure their servitude, or if it simply guaranteed the perpetual Spartan paranoia that kept the violence so extreme. On one hand, you have a support system. You are never truly alone. On the other, the Spartiates view you not as isolated units of labor, but as a standing army waiting for the trumpet of revolt. This very collective identity which sustains you is the justification for the state's most brutal preventative measures. You overhear a murmur in the fields, a very light joke, passed quickly down the line about a nearby Spartan who was so clumsy he tripped over his own bronze shield while inspecting a fence. The joke is not about humor, but about taking pleasure in the imperfection of the self-proclaimed equals. It's a tiny, brief moment of solidarity, a shared human reaction that says, they are not gods, they are men, and they can fall just like anyone else. But the moment is fleeting. The foreman coughs the sounds of labor resume, and the memory of the joke is instantly filed away, replacing the momentary lightness with a renewed sense of danger. You wipe the sweat from your brow, knowing that even a momentary lapse of control, loud laugh, a sharp disagreement, a glance of recognition shared with a kinsman could bring the full terrifying might of Lacedaemon down on your head. The sun beats down on the fertile land of Messenia, a land that remembers its true owners, and you, the field hand, are the physical vessel of that dangerous memory. The deep grinding exhaustion of the fields is matched only by the perpetual gnawing of hunger. We turn now to the Spartan diet, black broth, and bare sustenance, which is less a meal plan and more a direct daily testament to the vast economic gulf between the Spartan citizen and you, the Helot. You are the one who grows the food, yet you consume the meager leftovers. The Spartan's citizenship depends on your apo-phora, that fixed quota of barley oil and wine. Once that is set aside, what remains is yours. If the harvest is thin, your master still eats and you starve. If the harvest is good, you eat slightly, better, but never so well that you risk becoming too robust, too ambitious, or too noticeable. Your daily staple, the mainstream historical fact, of the Helot diet is usually barley. It's typically ground into a coarse meal and mixed with water to form maza, a kind of thick gruel or unleavened flatbread. You might augment this with lentils, beans, chickpeas, the durable legumes that provide necessary protein, and wild greens foraged from the edges of the fields. Olive oil, the foundation of the Greek diet, is precious. You consume a minimal amount, enough to survive, but rarely enough to truly thrive. Meat is a rarity, reserved for religious festivals or the occasional lucky catch if you risk trapping a small animal far from Spartan eyes. The Helot diet is therefore nutritionally sufficient for survival, but consistently lacking for heavy, sustained labor. You are perpetually running on half-power, a body designed for immense toil but intentionally starved of excess fuel. Your masters, meanwhile, eat slightly better, though still famously austere meals, in their communal mess halls, the syssitia. This brings us back to the Spartans' signature dish, the black broth, sak, or melas zomos. A subject we briefly mentioned, it is one of the greatest pieces of culinary propaganda in history. The recipe, as ancient sources describe it, involved boiled pork blood salt and vinegars. It's dark, intensely flavored, and reportedly so unpalatable to outsiders that one man, after tasting it, remarked he now understood why the Spartans were so willing to die in battle. This is the central, quirky or fringe tidbit about diet. The Spartiates eat the melas zomos as an act of discipline, a public demonstration that they reject the luxurious feasting of other Greek city-states. It is a choice to endure bad-tasting food to prove their warrior spirit. You, the Helots, subsist on a diet that is genuinely meager and monotonous, not by choice, but by brutal necessity. The Spartans' terrible dinner is a symbolic act of class superiority. Your sparse dinner is the literal product of your class inferiority. The irony is that the broth's main ingredients, pork and the produce, necessary to sustain the cooker, provided by your labor, and yet you, yourself, rarely taste meat. You stand in the field eating your coarse barley meal, and you make a dry, light joke. To yourself, well, at least I don't have to eat that black sludge. If that's what a ret tastes like, it'll stick with my dry maza thanks. This internal rebellion, this small moment of superior judgment over your master's bizarre rituals, is one of the few freedoms you possess. It's a way of saying their toughness is manufactured and theatrical, while your hardship is real and unceasing. The Spartan concern in theory was to ensure you weren't too well fed. Ancient authors noted a belief that Helots, who became too fit, too vigorous, or too strong, needed to be culled. They didn't want their labor force to be too physically capable of becoming a rebel army. You therefore have an incentive to appear slightly gaunt, slightly less than your potential as a form of self-preservation. The nature of this survival diet and the psychological manipulation behind it is complex. Historians still argue whether the Helot diet, heavy on cereals and legumes, was actually similar in its fundamental components to the diet of the average poor Greek citizen elsewhere, or if the constant pressure of the apo-phora made the Helot existence uniquely malnourished. The crucial difference is, of course, that an Athenian poor farmer worked his own land. You work someone else's, and your entire existence is perpetually precarious, resting solely on the mercy of the weather and the iron-clad expectations of your invisible masters. As the day ends, you return to your hut. The feeling in your stomach is a dull ache, familiar and constant. You share the last handful of lentils with your family. Every scrap of food is a victory, every calorie, a precious commodity hard-won from the earth. You try to sleep, but the emptiness in your stomach, combined with the low underlying fear, makes rest elusive. The constant exhaustion from the fields is only rivaled by the relentless psychological strain imposed by the most terrifying clandestine institution in Sparta, the Krypteias, shadow teenage assassins. This is the ultimate expression of Spartan paranoia, the deliberate organized terror that ensures you never truly feel safe, even in the darkest hours of night. The mainstream historical fact about the Krypteia is chillingly simple. It was a Spartan secret police force, a covert operation run by the Ephors, the highest magistrates. It consisted of the most promising, disciplined young Spartan men, graduates of the grueling agoge, the military training system, who were selected for this unique, lethal assignment. Their mission was clear and brutal: to patrol the countryside, especially the fertile Messenian lands where you live, and to sow fear among the Helots by selectively murdering any Helot who appeared too strong, too spirited, or too likely to become a leader in a revolt. Imagine the atmosphere this creates. You're not just scared of the obvious uniformed soldier. You are terrified of shadows of quiet movement in the olive groves of a sudden whisper on a moonless night. The danger isn't announced. It's subtle, pervasive, and random. You know that if you are seen walking with too much pride, or if you consistently outperform your neighbors in the field, remember that incentive problem we talked about with the apo-phora. You are painting a target on your back. You must appear broken, subservient, and unremarkable to survive. The Spartans structured this for maximum terror with minimum effort. They didn't need to kill thousands of you. They just needed to kill the best of you. By removing the natural leaders, the strongest bodies, and the sharpest minds, they decapitated any potential rebellion before it could organize. You know that if one of your neighbors disappears overnight, taken from his bed or ambushed on the road, it wasn't a bandit or an accident. It was the Krypteia. This leads to a chilling, quirky, or fringe tidbit about the Krypteia's origins and its dual purpose. Ancient sources suggest that for the young men themselves, the operation served as a brutal rite of passage. They were sent out into the wilderness with little food, forced to live off the land, and tasked with secretly eliminating Helots. The challenge wasn't just the killing, but the stealth. They had to hunt and murder without being seen, proving their cunning and ruthlessness. This taught the future Spartan leaders absolute control, lethal efficiency, and most importantly, a complete dehumanization of you, the Helot. They weren't murdering a man, they were carrying out a necessary silent chore for the state. The existence of the Krypteia puts an agonizing strain on the Helot community. If a Krypteia agent is caught, you, the Helot who saw him, face an impossible choice. Do you seize the chance to kill one of your oppressors, an act of justice that would bring the full, overwhelming force of Spartan retribution down on your entire village? Or do you remain silent, letting the teenage killer disappear into the night, preserving your villages? Fragile survival for another day. Most choose silence. The collective survival instinct always trumps the desire for individual vengeance. The whole concept is a mockery of traditional Greek values. You internally whisper a light joke about it. You know, I hear the Spartans complain their agogu is so tough because they have to wear a scratchy cloak and sleep outside. If they really want a challenge, they should try living next to the Krypteia. That's a real stealth mission, trying to be invisible while digging a ditch. It's a bitter humor, a small moment of intellectual superiority over their self-aggrandizing hardships. The terror of the Krypteia is why the Helot memory of freedom is so carefully hidden. Every night, as you prepare to sleep, you pull your family close and listen to the silence. Is that the wind in the trees, or is it the barely audible muffled footfall of a hungry young Spartan, armed with a dagger looking for a victim to graduate his class? The question of this institution's function is ongoing. Historians still argue whether the Krypteia was a regular institutionalized state practice throughout the classical period, as Plutarch suggests, or if it was an emergency measure used only during times of heightened crisis, like after a major revolt. For you, the answer is irrelevant. The rumor alone is enough. The knowledge that they can come for you, backed by the full weight of the state and religious sanction. Remember that annual declaration of war is what matters. The fear is the prison, and you live in that fear every moment. The rhythm of the agricultural year, normally a source of comfort and predictability, becomes another tool for your oppression. As the summer begins to transition toward autumn, you enter a period of extreme anxiety, the unrest of harvest times of heightened risk. The annual harvest festivals, which should be a moment of relief and communal celebration, are for you a time of intensified terror. The mainstream historical fact here involves the Spartan festival of the Krypteia. This was one of the most important religious holidays for the Spartans, dedicated to the god Apollo, and it took place around the month of Karneos, roughly August to September, coinciding perfectly with the crucial agricultural period when you, the Helots, were bringing in the last of the year's crops, especially the grapes and late grains. The festival required a 9-day truce forbidding the Spartan army from marching out in full force, a rule so rigid that it famously delayed their arrival at the Battle of Marathon and limited their initial contingent at Thermopylae. But here is the catch. While the Spartiate is engaged in religious feasting, communal dining, and ritualized chase races, a strange mixture of religious piety and military exercise, you are at your most vulnerable. The harvest is completed, the food supply is peaked, and the largest concentration of wealth, your apo-phora, in the storehouses is gathered. This is the moment when the Spartiates have the most to lose, and thus when their paranoia peaks. They understand that a large, productive Helot population is most dangerous precisely when it has finished its economic duty and the military is ritually constrained. The situation perfectly coincided with the deployment of the Krypteia, those secret teenage assassins we discussed. The Krypteia activity intensified precisely around harvest time. Why? Because the young Spartans were being initiated into their adulthood and warrior roles, and what better way to prove their readiness than by eliminating the most perceived threats among the Helots? You are literally the prey in their coming-of-age ritual. The Aya, quirky or fringe tidbit, involves the ritual chase element of the Krypteia festival itself. During the festival, a young man wearing garlands would run away, and a group of 5 garland-bearing youths would chase him, the staphylodromoi, or grape cluster runners. If they caught him, it was a good omen for the city. If not, the future was grim. Some scholars link this ritual chase to ancient agrarian ceremonies where a vegetation spirit was ritually hunted. The deeper, darker psychological reality for you, the Helot, is that this ritual hunt bleeds into the actions of the Krypteia. The official hunt for the symbolic spirit runs parallel to the very real unsanctioned hunt for the Helot leaders. You are constantly watching the faces of the Helots around you, searching for signs of unrest or discontent. The Spartans, meanwhile, are watching you. They are looking for the Helot, who smiles too broadly, who walks too confidently, who carries his own body with a pride that must be crushed. You reflect on the strange theatrical nature of your masters. They are so dedicated to their militaristic code and their religious festivals that they will sacrifice battlefield victory for piety. Yet they simultaneously engage in a clandestine, ritualistic murder campaign against their own people. It's an exercise in supreme hypocrisy, though you would never dare voice such a thought. You suppress a very light joke. Internally, they won't fight the Persians because of Apollo, but they'll stab a man in the dark because the Ephors said it was fine. I suppose Apollo just has to look the other way when it comes to dealing with the hired help. The long-term threat posed by your community is why the suppression is so systematic and why the festivals, which should grant a moment of peace, become periods of increased danger. Historians still argue, Weather weak, the timing and intensity of the Helot revolts were primarily dictated by Spartan vulnerability, such as when the army was away on campaign or a natural disaster struck her by coordinated Helot planning designed to maximize impact during the critical post-harvest period. For you, the peasant, the risk is always highest when the sun sets on a full barn. The sheer amount of food stored away is a physical representation of the massive power imbalance, and that imbalance is maintained only by terror. The abundance you create is literally the magnet that draws the greatest danger. You finish your work, but your true labor now is the careful, agonizing maintenance of a fearful demeanor until the period of unrest safely passes. The terror of the Krypteia and the pressure of the apo-phora are manageable day by day because they are predictable. But true existential fear strikes when the fabric of Spartan reality itself tears apart. This is the moment you remember most vividly, surviving the earthquake, fear of rebellion. It is the day the gods, or at least the god Poseidon, the earth shaker, seemed to take your side, and it was a moment of fleeting hope that curdled into even deeper oppression. The mainstream historical fact is that around 464 BCE, a massive earthquake struck Laconia, devastating the city of Sparta. The ancient sources describe the catastrophe in exaggerated but terrifying terms. Some claim only 5 houses remained standing, and the death toll was immense. For a city as dependent on its small elite warrior class as Sparta, this was an unimaginable disaster. The very foundation of their power was literally cracked and crumbling beneath their feet. You hear the ground roar, a sound like 1,000 bronze shields being dragged across stone. You see the cloud of dust rising over the Tegetus Mountains, a grim sign that the city of your oppressors has been crippled. The first shared instinct among the Messenian Helots is a surge of dizzying, dangerous hope. The Spartans are vulnerable. The time for the prophecy of freedom is now. This moment of Spartan weakness immediately triggers what is known as the Third Messenian War, a protracted revolt that lasted nearly a decade. You and thousands of your countrymen, Helots, and even some perioikoi, the free, non-citizen neighbors of Sparta, seized whatever crude weapons you could find, farm implements, rusty tools, rock sand rose up. The initial confusion in Sparta gave you a precious window of opportunity. The rebels' rallying point was the ancient symbol of Messenian resistance, Mount Athom. This imposing mountain peak, rising high above the surrounding plain, had been the last stronghold of your ancestors in the earlier Messenian wars. You know the stories of its defenses, its sheer slopes, and its symbolic power. Athom becomes your city of refuge, your temporary capital of freedom. You fortify the slopes, ready to fight the great military machine of Sparta, that is for the first time wounded and bleeding. The quirky or fringe tidbit associated with this event is the Spartan belief about the earthquake's cause. Thucydides records a tradition that the Spartans believed the earthquake was divine retribution from Poseidon because they had committed a sacrilegious act years before they dragged some Helot suppliants from the temple of Poseidon at Taenarus and killed them. The irony is delicious and heartbreaking. The god of the sea and the earth, who also causes tremors, seem to be punishing your masters for an old crime committed against your people. This belief, even if fleeting, gave your revolt a divine mandate, a rare psychological weapon against the famously pious Spartans. The relief of the moment, the initial belief that the god's fate, or simply geology, had intervened for your freedom, quickly turns into a grinding siege. The Spartans, led by King Archidamus, managed to rally and drive the rebels back to Mount Ithome. Unable to take the heavily fortified mountain, they are forced to do the unthinkable. They ask their allies for help, specifically the Athenian army, led by the general Cimon, which was known for its siege expertise. The story of the Athenians' dismissal is a crucial turning point not just for Sparta, but for all of Greece. The Spartans, seeing the sophisticated, confident Athenian troops, and perhaps, as Thucydides suggests, beginning to fear that the Athenians, with their democratic sympathies, might switch sides and aid the Messenian Helots, in Ithome abruptly dismiss the Athenian contingent alone. It was a massive insult that dissolved the fragile alliance between the two great powers. You watch from your mountain fortress as the Athenians are turned away, and you make a dark, dry, light joke with the man next to you who is sharpening a spearhead. They trust a god of the underworld more than they trust a man from Athens. The Spartans, they are never wrong about what they fear most. The tragedy is that their fear is well-founded, and it leads them to intensify the siege against you, the Helot. The revolt lasts years, demonstrating immense Helot determination and military prowess. But ultimately, the Messenian rebellion on Mount Ithome is worn down by siege. Historians still argue whether, too, this long revolt was ultimately a strategic success or failure for the Helots. It did not achieve final freedom, but it exposed Sparta's greatest weakness to the world, permanently crippled their manpower, and forced them to live under constant siege mentality. For you, the rebel Helot who eventually accepts the truce, the surrender means walking away from your homeland, accepting exile in the Athenian-controlled town of Naupactus, or facing a grim death. This moment of temporary freedom bought by blood and a massive earthquake only emphasizes the total systemic control Sparta exerted. You were never truly free even when the earth itself shook your chains loose. The failure of the Mount Ithome revolt, or your choice to endure the servitude rather than risk total destruction, means returning to a life defined not just by labor, but by deliberate psychological warfare. This is the reality of my public humiliation, the state's symbolic power. The Spartans knew that constant physical terror needed to be backed up by a system that attacked your sense of self and your Messenian pride. The mainstream historical fact is that the Helots were often forced to wear distinctive, demeaning clothing. The most famous example, mentioned by ancient sources like Myron of Priene, is the dog-skin cap. Kine. You are forced to wear this, possibly, along with rough leather garments whenever you enter a public area or travel. This isn't just a uniform. It's a visible, inescapable mark of your unfree status, a walking symbol of degradation. You are not a citizen, not a perioikos, not even a proper slave in the Athenian style. You are a Helot, and the world must know it instantly. The purpose of this attire is twofold. First, it enforces the Spartan obsession with order and hierarchy. In a society where the homoioi are all supposed to look alike, disciplined, perfect soldiers, you are the necessary contrast, the visual representation of everything they are not messy, unkempt, and subservient. Secondly, it is a psychological barrier. By constantly forcing you to display your shame, the Spartans hoped to make you internalize your low status, to forget the heritage of your free ancestors. Beyond the clothing, there were the ritualized acts of public shaming. We touched on the forced drinking of undiluted wine in front of Spartan youths in the mess halls. This quirky or fringe tidbit illustrates the Spartan attempt to teach their children what not to be. They parade you drunken and confused into their communal dining hall so the young boys can point and learn that Helots are inherently base, incapable of controlling themselves and therefore deserving of subjugation. The fact that the Spartans were notoriously sober makes this a particularly effective lesson in moral contrast. You are the living embodiment of vice, a cautionary tale wheeled out for a classroom of future killers. The degradation is compounded by the lack of judicial protection. Since the Ephors declared annual war on your population, remember that constant state of war, any Spartan citizen can beat you with impunity. You could be walking down a road in Laconia, minding your own business, wearing your dogskin cap, and any Spartan could decide to strike you purely as an exercise of power. If you retaliate, you risk immediate execution. Your only option is to absorb the insult and keep walking. You think of the collective memory of the Messenians. You manage to keep a low profile, enduring the public shaming by retreating into the internal fortress of your Messenian identity. You see the Spartan youths practicing their wrestling and their athletic drills nearby. Men devoted entirely to the physical perfection of their bodies, and you bent and calloused from a day of farm work, are simultaneously envious and contemptuous. You hear a perioikos, the free but politically powerless non-citizens who handle trade make a joke about a passing Spartan being too short to see over his own shield. You smile internally, but you know that you, the Helot, cannot afford even that small luxury. You mentally create a very light joke as a form of silent defiance. I should try stitching a small eye hole into this cap. Maybe if they can't see my eyes, they'll think I'm too simple to plot anything. Or maybe they'll just beat me for being a pretentious dog. The dark humor is a coping mechanism, a way of reducing the terror into a pathetic, manageable absurdity. The great question remains, historians still argue whether these systematic rituals of public humiliation, the caps, the beatings, the drunken spectacles, were genuinely effective at breaking the Helot spirit, or if they simply reinforced the Helots' collective hatred of their masters and hardened their resolve for future revolts. Did the psychological oppression succeed in convincing the Helot of his own inferiority? Or did it merely fan the flames of Messenian ethnic solidarity? For you, the answer is complex. They only succeed in making you appear docile. But the hatred they breed is a kind of hidden, generational inheritance passed down with the whispered stories of Mount Itom. Every forced act of submission is another layer of fuel for the fire of vengeance. The ultimate brutal paradox of your life is the rare and terrifying chance to prove your worth to the state that enslaves you. This is the moment you are forced to become the weaponized Helot military service as a trap. Sparta's fear of you is only exceeded by its occasional desperate need for you. The mainstream historical fact is that Helots were routinely involved in Spartan military campaigns, though rarely as frontline hoplites like their masters. Herodotus records that at the Battle of Krypteia, where the Greeks defeated the Persians, there were possibly 7 Helots for every 1 Spartiate. Citizens soldier up to 35,000 Helots in total. Your primary function was logistics. You carried the heavy bronze armor, ground the grain, cooked the food, and attended to your master, acting as a personal squire. This meant you were often right there on the battlefield, witnessing the brutal, glorious work of the homoioi. But you were not of them. However, as Spartan citizen numbers began to dwindle over the centuries due to war losses and rigid citizenship requirements, remember that apo-phora requirement for the systetia. The state became desperate for manpower. This opened up the paradoxical opportunity for Helots to fight as soldiers in exchange for a promise of freedom. This is where the trap is set. Helots who fought bravely were sometimes granted emancipation and given a new status. Neodemodes, literally new citizens of the demos. This was not full Spartan citizenship. It was a non-citizen freedom, placing you among the perioikoi. But it was a path out of the perpetual terror of Helotage. You might be asked to fight far from home, as hundreds of Helots did in Thrace under the general Brasidas, fighting for a state you hated in the hope of securing a distant, imperfect freedom for your family. But this promise of freedom came wrapped in a terrifying layer of treachery. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly captures Spartan paranoia as recounted by the historian Thucydides. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta, in a moment of great fear, organized a brutal test. They made a proclamation inviting the Helots who claimed to have served Sparta most bravely to present themselves for manumission. The state promised them freedom and invited them to celebrate by wearing garlands of honor. 2,000 of the proudest, most high-spirited Helots stepped forward. 2,000 men who were intelligent, strong, and brave enough to believe in the promise and risk their lives for recognition. The Spartans, seeing the very cream of the Helot population, now had a list of all their most dangerous potential leaders. Thucydides says that after these 2,000 Helots were crowned and marched around the temples, they were secretly killed, and no one ever knew how each of them perished. The memory of this massacre, whether it happened exactly as described or was simply a terrifying, cautionary tale spread by the Spartans, is woven into your consciousness. It is the perfect system of betrayal the state used, the highest virtue courageous, a lure for the ultimate punishment. You think of the men who stepped forward and you make a dark, quiet, light joke to suppress the horror. Well, they found freedom. The permanent kind, I suppose. The Spartans are nothing if not technically accurate about their promises eventually. The fundamental question this raises, one that is difficult even for modern scholars, is about Helot motivation. Historians still argue whether the Helots who fought alongside the Spartans did so because they believed the promise of freedom, however rare because of loyalty, to a specific master, perhaps a Mothax or a master they had known since childhood, or purely out of fear for their families who were left behind as hostages. Whatever the individual reason, the system ensured that your strength and courage were only ever allowed to be expressed in service to your own chains. Every victory you helped Sparta achieve only reinforced the system that oppressed you, unless, of course, you found yourself among the lucky few Neodemodes who survived. For the 2,000, and for you watching them disappear, that military trap was the surest path, not to freedom, but to an unmarked grave. The realization that military service is a deadly trap brings you back to the most fundamental question of your life. How do you escape this state-owned prison? You dream of freedom, a concept that smells distant like sea salt on a ship bound for a different land. This is the contemplation of the smell of freedom, dreams of flight. The mainstream historical fact is that the surest paths to freedom involved either successful collective revolt, which was exceedingly rare and usually ended in exile or massacre, as we've seen your individual flight, often aided by Sparta's enemies. During the Great Peloponnesian War, between Sparta and Athens, the Athenians established coastal garrisons, notably at Pylos in Messenia. These outposts served as beacons of hope, encouraging Helots to desert their masters and flee to the Athenian lines. You knew the risk. To abandon the Kleros and your Spartan master was to risk being hunted down by the Krypteia or by a Spartan patrol. The punishment for a captured runaway was a slow, agonizing death meant to serve as a terrifying example to others. Yet the desperation to escape the perpetual fear often outweighed the certainty of brutal punishment. If you managed to reach an Athenian fort, you weren't suddenly a free-landed citizen, but you had traded the oligarchic terror of Sparta for the democratic chaos of Athens. Your status among the Athenians was still precarious, but you were no longer bound to the Spartan soil and the apo-phora. The Athenians, in fact, famously settled the surviving Messenian rebels from Mount Ithome at the strategic town of Naupactus, where they became a permanent hostile thorn in Sparta's side, constantly launching raids into Laconian territory and encouraging more Helots to flee. This creates a powerful, quirky or fringe tidbit. The first free Messenian community in centuries was founded not by a glorious Messenian victory, but by the strategic maneuvering of their new Athenian patrons. The escape, though, was an agonizing separation. Unlike chattel slaves in other city-states who might be sold individually far from home, your family was a collective unit of servitude tied to the land. If you fled, you almost certainly left most of your family behind. If you were a man, you left your wife and children to face the double wrath of the state, the loss of your labor, and the suspicion that they aided your escape. You would only choose this route if the dream of one day returning to rescue them, or the agony of staying, became overwhelming. Your dream of freedom, however, had an expiration date tied to a far-off conflict. For over 3 centuries, Messenian Helots dreamed of nothing more than the final total defeat of Sparta. This dream came true in 371 BCE at the Battle of Leuctra, where the Theban general Epaminondas shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. You hear the news, perhaps whispered by a perioikos, passing through your village or shouted by a traveler. Thebans won. The Spartan army has been destroyed. Epaminondas immediately followed this victory with a move designed to permanently cripple Sparta. He invaded the Peloponnese and liberated Messenia. This decisive action leads to the founding of a new free city on the slopes of your ancient fortress, Mount Ithome. It is named Messin. For the first time in centuries, Messenians were free politically and geographically. You are suddenly given citizenship in a new massive independent city-state on your own ancestral soil. But you, the Helot, who has survived decades of quiet desperation, realize this freedom is a Krypteia of another kind. You are not free because you won the war. You are free because an external power, Thebes, released your chains for their own geopolitical gain to ensure Sparta was permanently weakened. You didn't break the system. The system was broken for you. The profound intellectual realization of this situation, that your salvation came from a foreign, hoplite phalanx, and not your own strength, is heavy. Historians still argue whether the Helot population embraced this externally imposed freedom fully, or if the trauma of generations of servitude made full citizenship difficult to achieve. For the liberated Helot, the challenge shifts from survival to self-governance. You make a wistful, light joke as you leave the Kleros, forever perhaps looking back at the fields you toiled. Well, Lycurgus, I guess I don't owe you that 70 medimnoi. After all, tell your Sicilian that freedom tastes better than black broth. You walk toward the rising walls of Messene, finally free, yet carrying the deep internal scars of having survived a system that was designed to break you and nearly succeeded. The walk away from the old Kleros, past the crumbled foundations of the Spartan military machine, is the end of an era, yet it forces a final, painful accounting. This section brings us to The final calculation, why survival, tropat. Fe fails. Con. You have endured the terror, the deprivation, and the betrayal, but the question remains, did your individual spirit truly survive the Helot system? The hard truth is probably not. Your survival over the long term ultimately failed because the Spartan system was not merely slavery. It was a comprehensive, generational system of terror, designed to defeat the human mind, not just the human body. Every feature of the Helot life, from the moment you were born to the potential of your liberation, was calibrated to induce perpetual fear and obedience. Consider the 5 major failure points that ensured your spirit's demise. First, the lack of legal recourse. You were owned by the state. You couldn't petition a single benevolent master. You were fighting an entire monolithic oligarchy whose existence was fundamentally predicated on your oppression. There was no court, no judge, and no law that protected you from a Spartan. The annual Declaration of War by the Ephors sealed your fate, establishing a legal fiction that made your murder a non-crime and your entire existence a military liability. Second, the economic trap of the apo-phora. By fixing the quota say that eium sernei medimnoi of barley, the Spartans ensured that you bore all the risk of famine or blight. If the harvest was bad, you starved while your master's mess hall was still provisioned. If the harvest was too good, you were suddenly a target of suspicion, marked as too successful, too ambitious, and too dangerous. Your only smart economic decision was to appear perpetually poor while meeting the minimum demand, which is an agonizing psychological constraint on human enterprise. Third, the selective elimination of leaders through the Krypteia and the massacres. The fact that the Spartans lured 2,000 of the strongest, most spirited Helots with the promise of freedom only to murder them all is the ultimate example of the state weaponizing hope. It teaches a brutal, mainstream historical fact that no Helot could ignore your strength is a liability, your courage is a fatal flaw, and your ambition is a suicide note. Your best chance for physical survival was to become the least memorable version of yourself. Fourth, the destruction of personal dignity through public humiliation. The ritualized beatings and the compulsory wearing of that rough dogskin cap were designed not to inflict injury, but to erase your Messenian identity. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit of Helotage that the most efficient form of torture was constant public shame. They didn't need to break your bones every day, they just needed to keep you aware every waking moment that you were subhuman in their eyes. Finally, the hostage situation of the family. They allowed you to keep your family unit, unlike chattel slaves in some places, but this was not a mercy. Your wife and children were in effect the collateral for your obedience. You would never lead a revolt, never steal too much, and never flee for freedom to Pylos, knowing that your family would bear the collective, terrible consequences of your actions. You walk toward the sun, setting over the new city of Messenian. You are free, yes, but you are not unscarred. The freedom you now possess was granted, not won by your hands in your life, until this point was spent managing a profound, corrosive fear. Historians still argue whether the Helots' survival of 3 centuries was a testament to their strength or an indictment of the Spartan system's efficiency. For you, the answer is personal. You survived because you learned to crush your own spirit, to silence the Messenian songs, and to keep your hopes small and quiet. You are physically free, but the habits of terror, the constant looking over your shoulder, the fear of appearing too strong, the ingrained docility in the presence of an armed manar, permanent chains on your soul. The Spartan system may have fallen, But the Helot mindset, the calculated survival, remains. And now, as we close the gates on the ancient world and let the dust of the Peloponnese settle, take a moment to notice the quiet around you. The relentless pressure of the sun on the Kleros is gone. The metallic scent of the Spartan spear has faded. That nervous feeling in your chest, the residue of 3 centuries of state-sanctioned terror, can begin to ease. You are no longer bound by the apo-phora, that crushing quota of grain, or the fear of the silent, hidden steps of the Krypteia. You can breathe. The historical echoes of this harsh existence are now just whispers in the darkness, stories from a world that valued discipline over compassion and fear over freedom. Let those names, Lycurgus, Ithome, Melazomos, drift away now. They are just words, old sounds that have lost their sharp edges in the vast silence of the past. As you settle deeper into your pillow, allow the contrast of that brutal ancient reality to enhance the comfort of this modern moment. The only requirement laid upon you now is rest. The only movement you need to monitor is the slow, gentle rhythm of your own breath. You made it back. You are safe. Sleep now, knowing that the struggles of history, however harsh, are far behind you, dissolved into the quiet hum of the night. May your dreams be soft, silent, and completely free. Sweet dreams.